Hello everyone, and welcome back to Conspiraseed. This week, we'll be discussing a case that I haven't heard of before, so not sure how well known around the world it is, but it is a little bit more well known in Germany, where it took place. I know I'm not a big channel by any means. I have like 430 subscribers, but hopefully this video can get some traction and spread some awareness on this event. Even if it doesn't, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching. Thank you for choosing to spend some time with me today. Now let's get into it. Sometime around September 1921, strange things began to occur around a farm in Germany called Hinterkaifeck. The maid quit because she was hearing strange noises from the attic and believed that the house was haunted. One of the residents of the house, Andrea Gruber, found a strange newspaper from Munich on the property. This is odd because the property is in Bavaria, Germany, which is 70 kilometers or 43 miles north of Munich. That's a long way for a newspaper to go, especially in the 1920s. Now, he couldn't remember buying the paper, but assumed that the postman had just dropped it by accident. It was later confirmed, however, that no one in the area subscribed to the Munich paper. Later, Andrea told his neighbors that he had discovered tracks on his property in the freshly fallen snow. The tracks led from the forest to a broken door lock in the farm's machine room. That night, the family said they heard footsteps in the attic, but Andrea found no one when he searched the building. He told several people about these instances, but refused to accept help, never reported it to the police, and he just told his neighbors and friends. It's a sunny but cold Friday afternoon on March 31st, 1922. Their new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived at the farm. Her sister accompanied her and, after staying and visiting for a bit, left. Sadly, she was most likely the last person besides the killer or killers to see the family and maid alive. There were 6 victims in total. Andrea Gruber, his wife Casilia Gruber, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, Victoria's 2 children, Casilia Jr. and Joseph, and then lastly the maid Maria Baumgartner. That same night, March 31st, Victoria, her daughter Casilia, and her parents Andrea and Casilia were lured into the barn one at a time and murdered. The assailant, or assailants, used a mattock, which is kind of like a hoe pickaxe combo, to kill them with blows to the head. They then moved from the barn to the living area, where, with the same mattock, they killed 2-year-old Joseph in his bassinet and Maria Baumgartner in her room. There is evidence that the assailant lived on the property for 3 days after the murders, including the fire being lit, food being eaten, and meat being cut. The next day, April 1st, coffee sellers arrived at the farm to take the family's coffee order. When no one responded to the knocks on the doors or windows, they walked around the yard but found no one. They noticed that the gate to the machine house was open but decided to just leave. Despite the children not showing up for school and the family not showing up for church on Sunday, no one went to investigate. Albert Hoffner, a machinery repairman, showed up on April 4th to repair an engine. He said that he hadn't seen the family and didn't hear anything out of the ordinary, just the usual sound of the farm animals and the dog inside the barn. After he waited about an hour, he just decided to start the repair, which he completed in roughly 4.5 hours. Around 3:30 p.m. that day, a neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, sent his 2 sons to the farm to see if they could make contact with the family. His sons returned home, reporting that they didn't see anyone. Lorenz then went to the property himself with 2 other neighbors. When the trio entered the barn, they found the bodies of the 4 murdered. Shortly after, they found the maid and Joseph murdered inside the house. Inspector Reingruber and his department investigated the killings. The investigations were slowed and hampered by the number of people who interacted with the crime scene, moved bodies and items around, and even cooked and ate meals in the kitchen. The day after the bodies were found, the court physician performed autopsies on the bodies in the barn. It was then determined that the weapon was most likely the mattock, but it couldn't be found anywhere. Evidence sadly shows that the younger Casilia had been alive for several hours after the assault and had tufts of hair torn out while laying in the straw. The skulls of the victims were removed from the bodies and sent to Munich for further examination. The police initially thought that this was a robbery gone wrong, as the family was quite wealthy. Going on that initial thinking, they interrogated traveling craftsmen, vagrants, and several villagers of surrounding cities. Upon further examination, they found a large amount of money still in the house and abandoned the robbery gone wrong theory. As I mentioned earlier, there was evidence that the assailant stayed in the house for days after the murders. Someone had been feeding the cattle, had eaten the entire supply of bread, and had recently cut meat from the pantry. With the robbery theory abandoned, there was no clear motive, and nothing was found at the scene that would lead to investigators deducing a motive. With what little information the police had, they began to gather a list of suspects. There have been repeated arrests, but no murderer has ever been found, and the case was closed in 1955. Less than a year after the murders, the farm was completely destroyed, revealing additional evidence, including a mattock hidden in the attic and a penknife in the hay within the barn. There are some inconsistencies in the investigation. In the official records, it was noted that the victims in the barn were probably drawn there by unusual noises from the barn animals. It was also later tested and revealed that human screams from the barn couldn't be heard in the living area, so could they have actually heard animal noises from the living area? This also does provide a nice cover, as they would not have been able to hear each other scream after going to the barn. If they had been able to hear the crunch of the mattock hitting a body, or the bodies hitting the barn floor, or even someone going, "Hey, who are you?" there might have only been one murder that night as opposed to 6. The night after the crime, the night of April 1st, a neighbor was passing their residence and noticed that the oven was on. Someone approached him from the house with a lantern that blinded him, and the neighbor hurried away. He did note, however, that smoke from the fireplace had a disgusting smell. This instance was not investigated, nor were there any investigations to try and figure out what was burned in the oven that night. It's possible that had this been investigated properly, these murders wouldn't be a mystery. At 3 a.m. on April 1st, the local butcher was on his way home when he saw 2 unknown figures standing at the edge of the forest. When they saw him, they turned so that their faces couldn't be seen. Also, in what's probably an act of trolling, in May of 1927, 5 years later, a stranger stopped a resident of the town at midnight. The stranger asked him questions about the murder, then shouted that he was the murderer before running into the woods, never to be identified. Now, I don't know why, but in my mind, this plays out like a season 4 Simpsons bit, where he's like, "Oh, it's me, ha ha ha," and he runs off into the woods.
"Oh, look at me, I'm making people happy. I'm the magical man from Happy Land in a gumdrop house on Lollipop Lane."
Which is why I personally think he's trolling. It is possible, however, that he was not trolling, and a person not remembering a face in the dark is responsible for this still being a mystery. Also, I've noticed that a lot of people in these villages are out and about in the middle of the night for no reason. Now, before we get into the list of suspects, the last thing that I want to say on the investigation is that in 2007, 15 German police academy cadets criticized the lack of professional forensic used in this case. They were particularly vocal about the failure to take fingerprints, which was already a common practice at the time. Had they obtained these fingerprints, maybe they could have caught the killer. There are so many times that the killer could have been caught, but instead, they took their secret to the grave. Now, let's get into the list of suspects. There are a good number of them, 13 to be exact, and most have semi-good reasons to be a suspect. Some, however, do not. The first suspect on this list is Carl Gabriel, who's the husband of the widowed Victoria. Now, I know what you're thinking. She was widowed. How could he have killed them if he himself was dead? Good question, and the answer to this theory is that he wasn't really dead. Carl had reportedly been killed in Arras, France by a shell attack in December of 1914 during World War I. That being said, his body was never recovered. After the murders happened, the locals began to speculate that he had in fact not died in the war. Now, Victoria had given birth to Yosef in her husband's absence, and it was rumored that the boy was actually the son of Victoria and her own father, André. The two did have an incestuous relationship that was well documented in court and well known in the village. After the end of World War II, prisoners of war from the region who had been released prematurely from Soviet captivity claimed that they had been sent home by a German-speaking Soviet officer who claimed to be the murderer of Hinterkaifeck. However, some of these men later revised their statements, which diminishes their credibility. Many theorized that the Soviet officer might have been Karl Gabriel, because those who claimed to have seen him after his reported death testified that he wanted to go to Russia. Now, for this to have happened, of course, he would have had to have survived the explosion in World War I, go to the farm to murder his family without being seen by anyone in town who would have known him, made his way to Russia without word of his survival reaching anyone he knew, then lived through the German assault on the Soviets in World War II, which was brutal. It just seems unlikely to me. The second suspect is actually one of their neighbors that I talked about earlier, the person who was responsible for finding the bodies, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Shortly after his wife passed in 1918, he was believed to have a relationship with Victoria and was the father of Josef. He came under suspicion by locals early on in the investigation because of several suspicious actions immediately after the discovery of the bodies. When he and the two others arrived at the farm to investigate, they had to break the gate to enter the barn because all the doors were locked. However, immediately after finding the bodies in the barn, he apparently unlocked the front door with a key and then entered the house alone. The most suspicious part of this is that a key to the house had actually gone missing several days before the murders. However, it is possible, since he was their neighbor and potential lover of Victoria, that he might have been given a key. When he was asked why he had gone into the house alone, he allegedly stated that he went to look for Josef. It is known that he had disturbed the bodies at the scene, potentially compromising the investigation. For many years after, local suspicion remained on him because of some strange comments, which were seen as indicating knowledge of details that only the killer should know. According to his information in the files for the case, a local teacher discovered Lorenz visiting the remains of the demolished farm in 1925. When asked why he was there, he stated that the perpetrators attempted to bury the family's remains in the barn but had been hindered by the frozen ground. This was seen as evidence that he had intimate knowledge of the conditions of the ground at the time of the murders. However, he was also their neighbor and familiar with the land, and he probably just saw that his ground was frozen and he made an educated guess. Another speculation was that he murdered the family after Victoria demanded financial support for young Josef. All of that being said, he won several civil claims for slander against people who described him as the murderer, so. Suspects 3 and 4 are Adolf and Anton Gump, brothers who became suspects due to their connections with the Freikorps Oberland, a paramilitary group. In 1951, the prosecutor investigated the brothers in relation to the murders. Their sister claimed on her deathbed that her brothers had indeed committed the murders. As a result, Anton was arrested, but Adolf had already passed away in 1944. After a short time, Anton was released, and in 1954, the case against him was finally dropped because they had no solid evidence that he participated in the crime. Suspects 5 and 6 are again brothers, Carl and Andrea S. In 1971, a woman named Teresa T. wrote a letter citing an event that happened when she was 12. She witnessed her mother having a conversation with the mother of Carl and Andrea. She said that her sons were the murderers of Hinterkaifeck. She said, quote, Andrea regretted that he lost his penknife. Now, if you recall, once the farm was demolished, they found a penknife in the barn. The knife, however, could have really belonged to anyone, even one of the murder victims. The police followed the lead with no results. The maid, who had quit way back at the beginning of this video, however, was certain that she had seen the penknife that they found in the yard when she worked there, which, if true, means it can't have been Andrea's knife. Suspect 7 is a man named Peter Weber. Weber was named as a suspect by a Mr. Josef Bentz. They had worked together in the winter of 1919 to 1920 as day laborers, and they shared a room. According to Josef, Peter spoke of a remote farm, Hinterkaifeck. Peter knew that only one couple lived there with their daughter and her 2 children. Josef testified in a hearing that Peter had suggested killing the old man to get the family's money. However, when Josef didn't respond to the offer, Peter stopped talking about it. Something that dismisses Peter to me is that the money was still in the house, which Peter specifically mentioned taking. Suspects 8, 9, and 10 are the Bickler brothers and George Siegel. The former maid suspected the brothers, Anton and Carl Bickler, to have committed the murders. Anton helped with the potato harvest before, therefore, would know the property. Anton reportedly suggested that the family ought to be dead on multiple occasions while working. The former maid also said that the dog barked at everyone but didn't bark at Anton. She believed that the brothers could have committed the murders together with George Siegel, who worked at the farm as well and was aware of the family fortune. Supposedly, George had broken into the home in November of 1920 and stolen a number of items, but George denies this. He did admit, however, that he had carved the handle of the mattock that was being used when he worked on the farm, and knew the tool would have been kept in the barn passage. Suspects 11 and 12 were another pair of brothers, the Thaler brothers. The former maid was also the one who suspected them. The brothers had already committed several minor burglaries in the area before the murders. The maid said that Josef Thaler stood at her window at night and asked her questions about the family, to which she wouldn't respond. In conversation, Josef Thaler claimed to know which family member was sleeping in which room and stated that they had a lot of money. During their conversations, the maid noted that there was another person nearby, supposedly his brother. The last suspect, suspect 13, is a man named Paul Mueller. He was brought up by author Bill James. Paul was the only suspect in an 1897 murder of a Massachusetts family, and Bill believes that Paul killed dozens of victims based on research in American newspaper archives. The murders have some similarities to Mueller's suspected crimes, including the slaughter of an entire family in their isolated home, use of a blunt edge of a farm tool as a weapon, moving and stacking the bodies of the victims, and a lack of a robbery. Bill suspects that Paul, who was described as a German immigrant, fled the United States for Germany by 1912 after investigators began to notice the patterns in family murders across state lines. You now know the potential motives for 13 people and why they could have committed the murders, and also why they could not have committed the murders. This is a case that's over a century old, before World War II, at a remote farm in a remote town in Germany. Not a lot of known information, the family wasn't discovered until days later, multiple suspects with no solid leads and no solid motive. With it being 4 days until the bodies had been found, who knows how much decomposition had set in. I couldn't find anything on the condition of the bodies, so I'm not sure what condition they were in. If the ground was frozen, as suggested earlier, maybe the bodies were preserved as it was cold enough. Maybe the barn animals got to them. There's been cases of pigs eating people. The point that I'm trying to make here is I'm not sure how much evidence you could have gotten from the bodies themselves. Out of the 13 suspects, I personally lean towards their neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, or suspect 13, Paul Mueller. The reason for me thinking their neighbor is that he was the one that was like, hey guys, we should go check out this family's house because we haven't seen them. And also, instead of checking the house first, we should check the barn first. Again, however, Lorenz actually won multiple civil suits for slander. Now, Paul Mueller wasn't even a consideration during the time of the investigation and was brought up later. The similarity between the murders that he's the only suspect for and the murders here are just crazy in my mind, are crazy similar, and I think they could be connected. What do you think about these murders? Who do you think committed them? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Thank you again for choosing to spend some time with me today, and I'll catch you in the next one.